It was supposed to be a normal afternoon, until my daughter arrived with a folder that ended everything I thought I knew about family. She stood in my doorway, calm and cold, telling me my house was gone, sold to pay off her husband's debts. When I asked what that meant, she laughed and said, "You're homeless now, Mum." That word didn't leave my mind, not when I packed my things, not when I looked at the walls my husband built. But what happened next, she never saw coming. If you're watching this, please like, subscribe, tell me where you're watching from, and drop a heart if this story made you think. It began with a knock that sounded too soft for the storm it carried. My daughter stood there, dressed well, holding a folder against her chest like a weapon she didn't need to raise. Her tone was firm, practiced, like she had said the same words in her mind 100 times before. She told me the house was gone, sold. I thought I had misheard her. The house my husband and I had built together, brick by brick, room by room, with laughter and small arguments, and nights spent dreaming of the future. She said it was gone, just like that. When I asked her what she meant, she didn't blink. She said the money had gone to pay her husband's debts. Gambling, failed business, and loans taken in secret. I remember the way she stood so calmly, like a woman reading a weather forecast that didn't concern her. I tried to ask how she could sell something that wasn't hers, but she interrupted before I could finish. "You don't need a house," she said. "You're old. You don't even use half of it. You're practically homeless already." That word, homeless, hit harder than anything I had ever heard in my life. It didn't echo once. It stayed. It followed me around the room like a ghost, pressing into the air between us. I looked around at the furniture, the framed photographs, the curtains I had stitched by hand, and suddenly, everything felt foreign. My home had turned into evidence of something I no longer owned. She placed a set of papers on the table and told me to sign where she had marked. I couldn't move. My eyes read the words, but my brain refused to believe them. Property transfer. Settlement. Outstanding debt. Her husband's name printed beside mine as if he belonged there. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. She was rewriting my life as if I were already gone. When she left, she didn't look back. Her heels clicked down the hall, sharp and certain, fading into the distance. The front door shut with a finality that felt like a verdict. I sat in silence for hours, trying to understand how a child could look at her mother and see currency instead of care. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there. Confident, heartless, using the same mouth that once called me Mum to strip me of everything I had left. I walked through every room, touching walls that still smelled of my husband's old cologne, the garden where he planted roses for our anniversary, the kitchen where we had celebrated her first job. Every corner held a memory that was now sold to strangers. But beneath the grief, something else began to rise. Not rage, not revenge, but clarity. I realized then that she hadn't just stolen my house. She had underestimated the woman who built it. She thought age made me weak, that loneliness made me desperate, that love made me blind. But love doesn't make you blind. It makes you patient. And patience, when betrayed, becomes power. By morning, I wasn't crying anymore. I was thinking about the papers, the signatures, the details she didn't explain. I remembered that my husband's will had a clause he never discussed with anyone but me. Something about protection. Something about ownership in name only being transferable under joint consent. I knew then that her victory wasn't as complete as she believed. The house might have been sold, but the foundation still had my name carved beneath it. And if she wanted to call me homeless, I would make sure she learned what it meant to have nowhere to hide. That house wasn't just walls and paint to me. It was the last living piece of my husband. We built it when we had nothing but plans and borrowed tools. Every brick held a story. Every room echoed laughter that time could never erase. I could still remember the day we laid the first stone. His hands were rough, my palms blistered, and we laughed about how one day our children would run through that hallway. He promised me that house would always be our safety, our shelter, and our proof that love could survive storms. For decades, it was exactly that. It carried every moment that defined my life. Birthdays with candles that dripped onto the tablecloth, anniversaries where he danced with me under dim kitchen light, nights when I held our crying daughter close after her nightmares. The smell of his book still lingered in the study, even years after he was gone. Every Sunday, I'd polish the frame that held his photograph by the window, watching sunlight hit his smile. That was my church, my comfort, my world. When he passed away, I thought the worst pain of my life had come and gone. I didn't know betrayal could hurt more than death. I added my daughter's name to the property papers out of love. It was supposed to be security for her future. I wanted her to feel trusted, to never fear losing her home. I never imagined she'd take that trust and trade it for convenience. After she left with those papers, I spent nights walking through empty rooms, touching walls that no longer belonged to me. It was strange. The same house that once held warmth now felt colder than any winter I'd ever known. The chairs looked unfamiliar. The curtains hung stiff and foreign. The house didn't reject me, but it no longer recognized me either. I kept thinking back to the day I told her she'd one day inherit everything. She had hugged me then, promising she'd take care of it. I believed her. I believed every word she said, because that's what mothers do. We trust our children, even when we shouldn't. We see them as the small hands we once held, not the strangers they've become. Every photograph on the wall seemed to ask the same question I couldn't answer. How does love turn into greed so quietly? My daughter didn't steal from a stranger. She stole from her own story. That house wasn't just property. It was proof that her father's hard work had meant something. And in one act, she erased him too. I sat in the garden that night, where his old wooden bench still stood. The roses had overgrown, the air thick with rain, and for the first time, I didn't feel safe there. The earth beneath me, once steady and familiar, felt distant. My home had become a memory that someone else now owned. I didn't cry much after that. Tears felt useless. I realized grief has two stages, the part where your heart breaks and the part where it hardens enough to act. My daughter thought she had taken everything from me. What she didn't understand was that when you lose what you love most, you stop being afraid of losing anything else. That makes you stronger than anyone expects. So I decided to protect what was left, not the furniture or the walls, but the meaning behind them. My husband had left me more than a house. He'd left me his wisdom, his foresight, his quiet habit of preparing for the worst. Somewhere in those papers, somewhere in that will, I knew he had written something that could save me, because he knew I'd always protect what was ours. That night, I stopped being a broken mother and became the woman he married, the one who could survive anything. And if my daughter thought she could take what I built, she was about to learn that I was the foundation she could never move. The truth came to me in the most ordinary way. A slip of paper, a signature, and a stranger's hesitation. I went to the land records office with my old folder in hand, hoping it was just a misunderstanding. The clerk behind the glass counter looked at me kindly at first, then his eyes narrowed. He turned a few pages, then looked up again, uneasy. He asked if I could verify the signature on the sale document. I leaned forward, and when I saw the mark they called mine, my hands went cold. It wasn't my handwriting. It wasn't even close. The signature was shaky, uneven, too short, almost like a child had tried to copy it. My stomach twisted. That wasn't an accident. That was intent. My daughter or her husband, someone, had forged my name. I asked for a copy, and when he handed it over, I saw another line that confirmed my fear. A loan account number, cleared just 3 days after the house was sold. It wasn't mine. It was registered under my son-in-law's name. My home hadn't been sold for family stability. It had been pawned to cover a man's gambling debt. The clerk sighed, almost apologetic. "You can file a complaint, ma'am," he said quietly. "But this looks official." He meant it was done, sealed, finished. But nothing is finished when you still have the truth. I walked out with the documents in my bag and a numbness that felt heavier than grief. Outside, I sat on the bench near the bus stop, watching strangers walk past, all of them going home. I didn't even know where mine was anymore. I stared at the papers again, every letter slicing deeper. I thought of my husband. He had always warned me, never let paperwork sleep in someone else's drawer. He was right. I had trusted too easily. When I returned to the house, my old house, I found boxes piled in the hallway. My daughter had already started packing my things, my clothes, my photographs, my memories, reduced to cartons stacked neatly against the wall. She wasn't there when I arrived. Only her husband, pretending not to see me, pretending he hadn't destroyed what wasn't his. He muttered something about needing space, but I didn't answer. I walked through the rooms like a ghost revisiting its own life. In the living room, I noticed a small folder on the coffee table. Bank receipts and printed emails. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. Inside were documents from a private lender. The loan amount, the due date, the penalty fees. My house had been collateral. My signature, their lie. I felt my pulse steady, my breathing slow. The shock had already turned into something else. Precision. I didn't rage. I didn't shout. I simply took photos of every document and slipped them into my handbag. When I left that night, I didn't close the door behind me. I didn't need to. The place no longer belonged to me in paper, but morally, spiritually, and legally, it still did. They could fake signatures, but not history. And they couldn't erase the fact that the land, the structure, and the registry all carried my husband's initials. Initials that never changed on the original deed. That night, I made myself a cup of tea in my small rented room and spread every copy I had across the table. The forged signature, the loan account, the fake witnesses. Piece by piece, it all fit. What they didn't realize was that in trying to erase me, they had left behind every breadcrumb I needed to expose them. I thought about going straight to the police that night, but then I remembered something my husband once said. Revenge spoken is revenge weakened. So I decided to wait, to move quietly, to let the truth ripen before showing it to the world. They thought they'd buried me under paperwork. What they didn't know was that paper was the only weapon I ever needed. That night was the quietest one of my life. The kind of quiet that doesn't bring peace, only pressure. Heavy, suffocating, endless. I sat, alone on the edge of the bed in a room that wasn't mine, staring at the small suitcase that now held everything I owned. My clothes, my documents, my husband's old wristwatch. Everything else had been left behind in the house that no longer called me home. The air smelled of damp plaster and cheap paint, but even that was better than the scent of betrayal. When you've lost everything, time slows. Every sound becomes sharper. The tick of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the echo of your own breathing. I didn't cry. The tears had already done their job. They had softened me enough to accept the truth. Now I needed them to dry so I could move forward. I sat for hours, staring at the wall, thinking about the years I spent building what had just been taken from me. The thought of my husband came back again and again. His photograph rested on the small table beside me, the same picture I'd kept since the funeral. His smile half faded, his eyes still kind. I whispered to him in my mind, "They took your house, love, but not your wife's fight." Because that's what he taught me, that strength doesn't come from shouting or breaking, but from refusing to disappear when others expect you to. I pulled the documents from my handbag and spread them out across the bed. The forged signatures, the fake transactions, the property transfer. I read every word slowly, tracing the lines with my finger, memorizing them like a story I would one day tell in court. Betrayal looks different on paper. Cold, official, and signed in ink that doesn't smudge even when your hands shake. I kept looking at that fake version of my name. It didn't belong to me. It belonged to a thief. At that moment, I stopped thinking like a mother and started thinking like the woman my husband once trusted with every account, every plan, every secret. I realized that everything they had done, every lie they told, had one weakness. It was all on record, and records don't vanish, no matter how much ink you pour over them. I opened my notebook and started writing. Dates, times, account numbers, witnesses, and every memory of conversations that could support me. My hand didn't tremble anymore. I wrote until the first light of dawn touched the curtain. I wrote not out of revenge, but survival, because I knew no one else would fight for me. My daughter had chosen her side, and I had chosen mine. Truth. By morning, I folded the papers neatly and placed them in an old envelope. The plan was simple, quiet, legal, undeniable. I would go to the one person who had always known my husband's affairs better than anyone, his old solicitor, Mr. Whitmore. It had been years since we spoke, but something told me he would remember. My husband trusted him once to protect our future. Now I needed him to protect what was left of it. Before I left, I walked outside to the small courtyard behind the rented room. The sun had barely risen, the air still cold. I took a deep breath and looked up at the pale morning sky. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel broken. I felt ready. I didn't pack much. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I locked the door behind me and stepped out with the same calm my husband used to carry before every hard decision. They thought I would fade quietly, that age would make me too weak to fight back. But they forgot that women like me don't lose everything. We reclaim it, piece by piece, with patience and proof. That morning, as the city woke up around me, I realized something important. They had stolen my home, but not my dignity. And dignity, once awakened, becomes unstoppable. By sunrise, my decision was already made. I brewed a cup of tea, sat at the small kitchen table, and stared at my phone. The number I needed wasn't saved, but I remembered it by heart. The same landline my husband used to call when he needed advice for the business, or when contracts got complicated. Mr. Whitmore, the solicitor. It had been almost 15 years since I last spoke to him, but something inside me said he'd remember. Men like him never forget the people who keep their promises. When the line connected, his voice sounded older, slower, but still sharp. The moment I said my name, there was a pause, then warmth. "Mrs. Dalton," he said, "I was wondering when I'd hear from you again." I didn't have to explain much. I told him my daughter sold the house, that my signature had been forged, and that I'd lost everything I'd built. He went quiet for a long second, then asked for one thing: copies of all the documents. His voice carried no pity, only focus. It reminded me of my husband. I scanned every page, one by one, using the small printer at the local post office. The man at the counter helped me send them through email. I didn't even tell him why. When I stepped back outside, the world felt strangely calm. I'd taken the first real step. I wasn't just a mother grieving betrayal anymore. I was a woman reclaiming her life through law, not anger. That afternoon, Mr. Whitmore called me back. His tone was serious now, professional. He said, "Your husband was a clever man, Mrs. Dalton. He left one clause untouched, a contingency transfer for protection against fraudulent sale." I didn't understand at first. Then he explained that before my husband died, he had added a condition to the original deed. If the property was ever sold without my consent, all related assets, including profits and linked accounts, would be frozen until a review confirmed the sale's validity. It was meant to protect me in case I was ever pressured or deceived. My husband had prepared for betrayal long before it came. He hadn't just left me love. He'd left me armor. Mr. Whitmore told me he could file for immediate injunction, a legal freeze on the house and all connected bank accounts. He said it might take weeks to process, but once approved, the property couldn't be touched, sold, or transferred again without my authorization. I didn't hesitate. I gave him permission to proceed with everything. My voice didn't shake once. When I hung up, I sat back in my chair and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was justice, waking up after being asleep for too long. The same house they'd stolen in arrogance was about to become the reason they'd lose everything. That evening, Mr. Whitmore sent a courier to collect the original documents from me. He said he would deliver them directly to the land tribunal. I sealed the envelope carefully, adding one more thing inside: a handwritten note to my husband that I'd kept folded in my wallet for years. It read, "If you can still see me, know that I'm keeping my promise." For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. No nightmares, no anger, just stillness. When I woke, I knew the storm had already begun to move, and it wasn't mine to fear anymore. The next morning, as I walked past my old house on the way to the shop, I saw my daughter's car parked outside. She stood on the porch, yelling into her phone, her face pale, her hands shaking. I didn't stop walking. I didn't need to. The law was already knocking louder than I ever could. That's the thing about betrayal. It feeds on your silence until you learn how to weaponize it. And that day, silence was my greatest weapon. The weeks that followed were quiet, the kind of silence that hides motion beneath it. To anyone watching, I was just an old woman keeping to herself, spending long afternoons reading and watering plants in a rented flat. But in reality, every day was a move, a step, a piece of the storm gathering its strength. I started with the paperwork. Mr. Whitmore's office sent me documents to sign, each one more powerful than any word I could have spoken to my daughter. I signed them slowly, carefully, never rushing. Every stroke of my pen was an act of correction, undoing what she and her husband had done behind my back. I authorized the freezing of joint accounts where her name still lingered, cutting off her quiet access to what wasn't hers. I withdrew funds I had earned through my husband's pension, moving them into a private legal trust under my sole name. The solicitor filed formal requests to investigate the house sale, marking it as a potential case of fraud. I didn't need to announce it. The process itself would expose the truth. Paper trails do not lie, and theirs was full of footprints. I didn't call my daughter. I didn't confront her. Silence is heavier than shouting. It gives people time to wonder how much you really know. I began keeping a small notebook beside my bed. In it, I noted every date, every message, every interaction. Not to dwell on pain, but to build evidence. Every time her husband came to the house, every bill paid from the proceeds of the sale, every withdrawal made using the forged documents. It all went into those pages. I treated that notebook like a weapon disguised as memory. At the same time, I contacted a friend who still worked at the local newspaper. I didn't tell her names. I only mentioned that I knew of a potential property scam involving forged signatures and family betrayal. She asked if I'd be willing to speak on record someday. I told her, when the time is right. I wasn't seeking sympathy. I wanted a witness, someone to make sure what happened wouldn't stay buried in whispers. My daughter, unaware of any of this, continued living her life as if nothing had changed. She posted photos online of expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and the car she'd bought with savings. Her husband bragged about paying off debts, calling it a fresh start. They had no idea how close their empire was to crumbling. Mr. Whitmore called me every few days with updates. He spoke with calm precision. Property restrictions were active, the investigation was moving forward, and the estate fraud division had quietly begun reviewing the documents. I could almost hear the gears turning, the slow grind of justice working in silence. At night, I thought of my husband again. He would have smiled at how quiet my fight had become. Not out of fear, but wisdom. Never warn those who've wronged you, he used to say. Let them hear your footsteps only when it's too late. That sentence played in my head like music while I waited. Every so often, I'd pass by my old street. I'd see the curtains drawn, the lawn untrimmed, the driveway empty. My daughter and her husband were too busy covering cracks to notice the foundation shifting beneath them. That house no longer belonged to them. Not in name, not in law, not even in spirit. By the third week, I received a call from the bank confirming the freeze had taken effect. All accounts associated with the forged transaction were locked. That meant no mortgage payments, no loan access, no way to sell the property again. My daughter's number flashed on my phone that evening, but I didn't answer. She left a message, her voice trembling, pretending to sound calm, asking if I'd heard anything strange about the bank. I deleted it. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to yell. The storm was already forming, and I was no longer its victim. I was its quiet center. It happened on a Monday morning, the kind of morning that starts quietly before everything changes. I was sitting by the window with my tea when my phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Whitmore. It was brief, professional, and powerful. The documents have been served. I didn't need to ask what that meant. Somewhere across town, my daughter and her husband were about to read the letter that would undo everything they'd built on lies. The letter was sent by hand, sealed with the official stamp of the court. A delivery man knocked on their door just after breakfast, asking for a signature. My daughter, half-dressed and distracted, took it without reading the sender's name. It wasn't until she saw the words, "By order of the court," printed across the top, that her face went pale. Her husband, standing behind her, snatched the envelope from her hand. He skimmed the first few lines and then froze. Inside was the truth they'd been running from, a legal injunction confirming that the house sale was under investigation for fraudulent transfer. Every asset connected to that transaction, including the funds they had received, was frozen until further notice. Attached to the notice were copies of the signatures they'd forged and a detailed statement from my solicitor outlining every irregularity the fraud division had uncovered. I didn't see their reaction, but I could imagine it. The laughter, the arrogance, the false sense of victory. All of it collapsing in seconds. My daughter, who had called me homeless, now stood in a home she no longer legally owned. Her husband, who had used my trust to pay off his debts, was now listed as a respondent in a criminal investigation. The law had done what my voice never could. It had made them listen. By noon, my phone began to ring. First once, then twice, then nonstop. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Mr. Whitmore called soon after and said calmly, "They've received the papers. Expect silence for a few days. That's usually when reality settles." He was right. The next 3 days passed without a single call or message, not even from relatives. The same people who once gossiped about my ungrateful daughter now stayed quiet, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. But the exposure didn't stop at the letter. A week later, a small column appeared in the local paper, written by the journalist I'd spoken to weeks earlier. The article didn't use our names, but the story was unmistakable. Elder woman's property sold without consent. Legal action underway. The headline alone sent ripples through our community. Neighbors began whispering. Friends who had once believed my daughter's version of events now called to check in. I kept my responses brief. "I'm fine," I said. Just letting the truth do its work. Behind the scenes, the law moved fast. The fraud division confirmed that the transaction had been pushed through using falsified identification and forged documents, evidence that would later become crucial in court. Mr. Whitmore informed me that the investigation had expanded to include the notary who processed the sale. It turned out that my son-in-law had bribed a clerk to approve the paperwork without proper verification. Every thread they'd pulled to deceive me was now tightening around their own necks. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. Justice doesn't need an audience. It only needs time. Each morning, I folded the newspaper and set it beside my husband's photograph. "It's happening," I whispered once. Not with joy, but with relief. Because after months of humiliation, the world was finally seeing what I had known all along. That age doesn't make you powerless, and silence doesn't mean surrender. My daughter eventually broke her silence. A short, trembling message appeared on my phone one night. "Mom, please, we need to talk." I read it once and put the phone down. There was nothing left to say. The talking was over. The law was already speaking for me. The day of the hearing arrived with cold air and heavy clouds, the kind of morning that feels like judgment itself. I woke early, dressed in quiet colors, and pinned my husband's cufflink to my sleeve. It was my small way of taking him with me, of reminding myself that I wasn't walking into that courtroom alone. Mr. Whitmore met me at the steps, steady as always, holding a folder thick with evidence. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already written. When we entered the courtroom, my daughter sat at the defendant's table beside her husband. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but in spirit. Gone was the confidence that used to fill every room she entered. Her eyes darted from me to the judge, unable to stay still. Her husband, however, sat upright, jaw tight, pretending calm. His arrogance hadn't yet learned fear. He wore an expensive suit, but no suit can hide guilt. The hearing began with the clerk reading out the case title. My name, my late husband's estate, and the allegation of property fraud. The sound of it filled the room like thunder. Then the first documents were placed on the judge's desk. 2 versions of the house deed, one authentic, one forged. The difference was clear even to the untrained eye. My original signature, careful and neat, next to their version, rushed and false. The prosecutor spoke next, outlining the chain of transactions, the false authorization, the illegal loan clearance, and the transfer of funds to a personal account belonging to my son-in-law. Every word cut through the silence. I sat still, hands folded, while the truth unwrapped itself, line by line. When they displayed the bank statement on the projector, showing the deposit made 2 days after the sale, I saw my daughter flinch. For the first time, her husband's hand moved from hers. Then came the moment that changed everything. The judge asked for clarification on one particular detail. Who authorized the release of funds? The courtroom door opened, and the bank's compliance officer entered. A woman in a gray suit, holding a statement signed under oath. She confirmed that the signature used to finalize the sale did not match any record on file for me. Instead, it matched one used previously by the son-in-law on another business document. His face turned white. The judge looked directly at him. "Is there anything you wish to say?" He muttered something about clerical error and miscommunication, but his voice broke halfway through. The prosecutor interrupted, producing another piece of paper, a transfer slip showing the same man using the sale money to pay off his personal gambling debts. The courtroom went completely still. My daughter began to cry quietly, realizing she'd been used as a shield in his deceit. She wasn't the mastermind. She was the cover. For a long time, I'd imagined confronting her with anger, but sitting there, I felt none, only pity. Betrayal makes people foolish. Greed makes them blind. Mr. Whitmore stood and presented the final evidence, my husband's untouched clause. He read it aloud, steady and deliberate. In the event of an unauthorized sale or misuse of marital property, all rights revert to the surviving spouse, and all profits derived therefrom are subject to restitution. The room shifted. Even the judge straightened, impressed by the foresight. My husband had written those words decades ago, never knowing they'd one day save the home we built. That clause was my shield, my proof, and my closure all in one. The judge's ruling came swiftly. The sale was declared void. Ownership of the property reverted entirely to me. In addition, the court ordered repayment of the stolen funds, legal fees, and damages from my son-in-law's business account. The total figure made him sink lower in his chair. My daughter's sobs filled the room, but I didn't look at her, not out of cruelty, out of peace. When I left the courtroom, reporters waited outside. Flashes went off. Voices shouted questions, but I walked past them without a word. The story was theirs to tell. My part was finished. I didn't need revenge, I had truth, and it had spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear. After the verdict, the courtroom emptied slowly. Papers rustled, footsteps echoed, but I stayed seated for a moment, letting the reality sink in. The house was mine again, legally, rightfully, entirely. Yet there was still one part of the story no one in that room knew except Mr. Whitmore and me. The hidden clause my husband had tucked away decades ago. The one that didn't just return the house, but turned everything upside down for those who had stolen it. That clause had been sitting quietly inside our marriage trust for over 30 years. It was something my husband had written himself, not because he foresaw betrayal, but because he believed in protection. It stated that if our home was ever sold, transferred, or mortgaged without both signatures present, full ownership and every related asset would automatically revert to the surviving spouse. But there was more. It also triggered a secondary clause in our joint business fund, a penalty for dishonest disposal of property. That meant every asset my daughter and her husband owned under that sale was now subject to recovery by the estate. I remembered the moment Mr. Whitmore discovered it. He'd leaned back in his chair, reading it twice, then smiled faintly and said, "Your husband left you a net strong enough to catch a lie." Now, as the judge read it aloud, I saw the same realization dawn on my daughter's face. The color drained from her cheeks. Her husband stared down at the papers, eyes wide, as though they'd just realized they'd not only lost the house, but everything connected to it. The judge ordered a full financial restitution. The figure was staggering, over $3.2 million, the sum of the property's value, the illegal loan repayment, and the damages caused by fraudulent sale. It was to be repaid from their joint business account, which had already been frozen by the court. What they once called their future now belonged to the past. When the numbers were announced, the courtroom fell silent. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just breathed. Slowly, deeply. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of loss lift off my chest. Not because I'd won, but because I'd survived the kind of betrayal that could have broken me. The law hadn't punished them. It had simply balanced what they'd tipped. Outside, Mr. Whitmore walked beside me, holding the papers that sealed the case. "You did well," he said quietly. "Your husband would be proud." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Pride wasn't what I felt. It was something deeper. Closure. The kind that comes when justice doesn't shout, but stands firm. Later that evening, I received an official letter confirming the full reinstatement of ownership. It came with a note from the solicitor's clerk, written in neat handwriting. Clause executed successfully. I smiled at those words. My husband's foresight had done what time and patience alone never could. It had protected me even after his death. That small legal paragraph buried in an old document had become my quiet revenge. A week later, my daughter appeared at my gate, pale and shaken. She didn't come to apologize. She came because she had nowhere else to go. Her accounts were frozen, her husband under investigation, and her friends gone quiet. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. There are moments when love still exists, but can no longer protect. I told her calmly, "You called me homeless, yet here I stand, and here you are." She lowered her head, tears falling onto the path. After she left, I walked through the house, my house, room by room. Everything smelled different now, not of betrayal, but of peace. I ran my hand across the dining table where my husband once read the newspaper, where I once served birthday cake to a daughter who used to laugh without malice. That table had seen everything: love, loss, and now justice. When I finally sat down, I looked out the window at the garden my husband and I planted together. The late sun touched the flowers, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the world quiet down around me. The word homeless had been her insult. Now it was her reality, and I didn't need to say a single word. That evening, when the world was quiet again, I sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea and the legal papers spread out before me. The house was warm, filled with a silence that didn't ache anymore. I thought about everything that had happened: the betrayal, the sale, the courtroom, the verdict. And I realized that what I'd lost was not my home, but my illusion of family. The truth was cleaner now, colder, but real. I looked around the living room where every wall had a story. The photo of my husband still hung near the mantel, smiling in his usual gentle way. I used to think his passing left me unprotected, but I was wrong. His foresight had been my shield, his love my quiet weapon. Even from the grave, he had stood beside me. The clause he wrote was more than legal text. It was his promise that no one, not even our own blood, would ever erase the life we built together. I thought of my daughter's face in court, pale, shaking, stripped of the pride that once made her cruel. I didn't hate her. Hate is heavy, and I had carried enough. What I felt instead was distance, the kind that time doesn't always heal. I understood then that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without letting the pain control you. In the days that followed, letters came, some from relatives pretending concern, some from neighbors offering sympathy. I read them all and replied to none. Everyone wants to comfort the woman who wins, not the one who suffers. But I didn't need comfort. I needed quiet, and I had it now. My daughter never returned after that day. She moved away with what little remained, and I didn't chase her. I had chased her enough all my life, through schools, heartbreaks, and every foolish decision she made. This time, I let her go. Sometimes peace isn't found in reconciliation, but in letting silence speak where words have failed. I used the compensation to restore the house. Fresh paint, repaired shutters, a new garden fence. It wasn't about money. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. Each nail, each brushstroke, felt like mending a wound that had festered too long. When it was done, the house looked alive again, not haunted by betrayal, but bright with renewal. Every morning, I sit by the window and watch the sunlight touch the garden. I see the roses bloom, just as they used to when my husband was alive. I imagine him standing there, pruning the stems, humming quietly. The world moves on, but some things, the right things, stay. I often wonder if my daughter ever thinks about what she did. Maybe she does, maybe she doesn't. But one day, when she passes by a familiar street and sees a house that looks like ours, she'll remember. She'll remember the woman she called homeless, standing taller than the lies that tried to bury her. And that memory will do what no punishment can. It will last. Now, as I look into this camera and tell you my story, I don't feel anger. I feel strength. I've learned that betrayal doesn't end you. It introduces you to the version of yourself that refuses to break. My husband left me love in the shape of law, and I used it not for revenge, but for peace. So here I am, in the same home, under the same roof, with the same name that once hung above the door. My daughter took everything she could except my will to fight. That she could never sell. If you're watching this, remember this. Family can betray you, but truth will always return home. Tell me, if the person you raised sold your roof and called you a beggar, would you cry in the dark, or would you rise in the daylight and let the law remember who you are? And if you've come this far with me, please like the video, subscribe, tell me where you're watching from, and drop a heart if you believe justice always finds its way home.